I, 17, male, have been living with my mother ever since I was 5 years old. My biological dad passed away when I was five, so it had just been my mom and I against the world for my entire childhood. She told me that she'd worked very hard to raise me and would be out every day for hours and hours to be able to pay the bills as well as my education and whatever else I needed. We used to live in a small rented apartment, and it was tough for both of us, but I loved her for raising me to the best of her abilities. She, being a working woman, had taught me very early on that I'd get nowhere if I was lazy. So I did my part well, too, and studied hard so that I'd be able to get a decent job once I graduated, and then I'd be able to help my mother as well. We weren't rich, but we led a comfortable life. Hard work and independence were two qualities that my mother taught me to value, and I'm always going to be grateful to her for that. I've been a straight A student all my life and also play football, so it all looks good on college applications. But recently, I got my first B, and I know the reason for that is my stepfather. A couple of months ago, my mother got married to a man she met on a dating app. She'd had boyfriends before, but it never lasted long enough for it to get serious. My stepdad and her had been dating in secret for a while, so it only made sense that they'd get married. She told me about all of this only a few weeks before the wedding, and I was really taken aback. It hadn't even occurred to me that my mother used dating apps, but she explained to me that she thought that now that I'm old enough, she can finally look for love again because she doesn't really want to be single anymore. I respected that, and I was pretty excited to have a father figure in my life. I met my stepdad once or twice before they got married, and he was nice to me both times. After the wedding, we moved into a bigger house, and my mother quit her job so that she could take care of the household chores. Even during the initial few days after the wedding, he was quite nice to me, but within 2 weeks, he started showing his true colors. Just 2 weeks after the wedding, there was an incident where I'd accidentally spilled some soup on the couch. My stepdad had just walked in after work when I spilled, and as soon as he saw that, he started shouting at me at the top of his voice about how careless and irresponsible I was. He said that I didn't even deserve to live in a house like this, and that my mom and I should just return to the sewer that we belonged to because we had no class. That comment stung because I knew how hard my mother used to work just to be able to afford everything. I was shocked at his behavior and tried to fight back, but that pissed him off even more and he threatened to pack my stuff up and throw me out. He wouldn't even listen to my mother, who was already crying because of all the yelling and begging him to stop fighting with me. That was the first big fight that I had with my stepdad, and after a while, I realized that there was no point arguing with him and that if I wanted a peaceful life in this house, then I just have to suck it up and let him yell himself hoarse instead of arguing and make it worse. There were several more instances after that where he'd get triggered by something small and irrelevant that I'd done and start yelling at me about my behavior and how my mother had failed to raise me well. And it always ended with him threatening to kick me out if I didn't change my ways. I learned to tune him out eventually and focus on whatever else I was doing so that I'd be able to resist the urge to argue with him. A few days ago, I'd skipped school since I was feeling under the weather and decided to study at home for a test the next day instead. My stepdad had also taken a day off of work, so we were all home together. I was studying in my room when I heard yelling downstairs and decided to check out what had happened. Of course, it was my stepdad who was shouting while my mother cleaned something up in the kitchen. There were shards of porcelain on the floor, and I guessed that she'd probably dropped a bowl or something. My stepdad continued to yell at her and how he regretted even marrying her, that he'd never have gone through with it had he known that both my mother and I were so clumsy and irresponsible. My mother was crying silently, and I could see that, so I decided that I'd had enough and told my stepdad to shut up and that he absolutely couldn't speak to my mother that way. So he turned on me and started yelling at me instead, but I decided that I wasn't going to back down this time. and yelled at him right back. Once again, he said that he was going to throw me out on the street if I was disrespectful towards him, and I shot back, saying that if he could, then he would have done so by now. Things were getting pretty heated, and I could see him physically restraining himself so that he didn't end up hitting me because that's how angry he was. My mother noticed that as well and intervened. She forced me to go back upstairs and said that I had no right to be arguing with my stepdad like this. I did go back to my room, but I was fuming and couldn't believe that my self-sufficient mother was letting this man walk all over us like we were nothing. Soon after, she walked into my room and told me that I needed to apologize to my stepdad and that I couldn't behave this way. I was shocked that she was blaming me for reacting like a normal person would and not her husband for acting like a total madman with anger issues. I reminded my mother that so far I'd been yelled at by my stepdad for spilling milk, studying too late, making lunch for myself when nobody else was home, and other stupid reasons. I couldn't believe that she expected me to just suck it up and let him treat me like crap. And not just that, but he treated her like crap too, since even my mom had been yelled at for stupid stuff multiple times by now. I told her that I didn't want to live with him anymore, and it was clear that he didn't want it either, since he'd threatened to kick me out over every little thing anyway. My mother and I argued for a while, but eventually she just snapped at me and said that I had to learn to keep my mouth shut and respect my stepdad since he was the reason we were living the good life now. She then left, and that's when I completely broke down. I felt as though Mom wasn't the same woman who had raised me anymore since she was willing to change herself and let this man push her around simply because he paid the bills now. I was devastated that she was siding with him instead of standing up for herself and her son. On top of that, I had a test the next day, but I was way too emotionally drained to do anything but curl up in my bed and cry. I cried for hours after that. My mother knocked on my door to call me for dinner, but when I ignored it once, she didn't bother with me again. I don't even know how long I was in bed for, but half an hour before midnight, I got up and wiped my tears and decided to escape. My grandparents, my father's parents, lived a few blocks away from my school. I was determined to leave this house. I just couldn't stay with my stepdad anymore. I knew that my grandparents would gladly let me live with them since they told me the same my entire childhood, so I wasn't too worried about showing up so late unannounced. When I was younger, my mother would often drop me off at my grandparents' place if she had to work late or she just wanted to hang out with friends. Even when I was old enough to stay home by myself, I would just go to my grandparents' place if I ever felt lonely whenever my mom wasn't home. Their house was basically my second home anyway. But yes, in the middle of the night that day, I decided to run away. I packed some clothes, my books, and my toiletries in a duffel bag and snuck out of the house as silently as I could. Then I walked all the way from our house to my grandparents' place with my stuff. By the time I reached there, I was panting like crazy, but I somehow managed to ring the doorbell. I had to wait for around 15 minutes before my grandpa opened the door. I'd probably woken them up from their sleep, but I had bigger things on my mind right then. I went in, and within minutes, my grandparents were wide awake and making sure that I was all right. They heated some soup for me since I was starving and it was kind of cold outside. Then, finally, after around half an hour of them fussing over me and my well-being, we got to the reason why I'd shown up at their doorstep in the middle of the night with all my things. I told them about everything my stepdad had been putting me through and how he'd threatened to kick me out over the smallest things while my mom said nothing. And then I told them about what had happened that day itself, which was the last straw for me. I couldn't accept the fact that my own mother was telling me not to stand up for myself and was, in fact, forcing me to live with a man who didn't have even an ounce of respect for either of us. This was what compelled me to run away, and I told them that I was hoping I could live with them for a while. My grandmother had tears in her eyes, and my grandpa was red in the face by the time I finished telling them what had happened. They told me that I could live with them for as long as I wanted to, and they'd be more than happy to let me stay. My grandpa was fuming and ranting about how ungrateful my mother was being, and suddenly he said something that caught my attention. I just had to ask him about it. He said that he wasn't sending anything to my mother anymore after what he'd just heard. I was obviously very confused since I didn't know what he was referring to, and I asked him about it. My grandma tried to shush him and told me that I didn't need to know, but my grandpa told me that now that I was almost an adult, I was old enough to know what he was talking about. So, in spite of my grandma's protestations, he told me something that completely changed my perception of my mother. Apparently, my mother really wasn't as independent as I'd thought she was. My grandparents had been consistently sending her hundreds and hundreds of dollars every month over the years after my father passed away, since they felt responsible for her and wanted to take care of her. So they'd sent her a decent amount of money every month to take care of us. Of course, it wasn't a huge amount, but it was enough for us to get by when it was combined with my mother's salary. And that was the first shocker for me, since I'd always assumed that my mother earned enough to pay for everything that we had and that she was completely independent. She'd never mentioned that she had help. More recently, a couple of months before my mother got married, my grandpa's business really took off. My grandparents run a bakery nearby, and while they were always moderately popular and made a decent amount of money, they'd taken off in recent times after a famous food blogger had posted about their cupcakes. That's when their business blew up, and it's been going pretty great so far. So much so that they're even thinking about branching out. Anyway, once they started earning almost triple the amount that they were previously, my mother asked them to help her pay for the house that she was planning to purchase with my stepdad. She told my grandparents that he was ready to pay for half of it, and she needed help to pay for the other half. My grandparents readily agreed since money wasn't an issue anymore, and like always, they did it to provide for us, like my dad would have had he still been alive. After my grandpa told me all of this, I didn't even know how to react. My entire life, I'd believed that my mother had built her life from scratch, all on her own, and she'd never once addressed all the help that she'd had. I'm not saying it takes away from her independence, but she's the one who used to tell me that I should never rely on anyone for money or help, not even her. Now, all those life lessons mean a lot less to me than they did earlier. She was my inspiration, but now I'm not so sure anymore, since whatever my grandpa told me, coupled with her strange pushover behavior around my stepdad, has made me question everything. So much so that I couldn't even focus on the test the next day. And that earned me my first B. All of this happened a couple of days ago, and while my grandpa and mother have been fighting on call regarding where I could be staying every day now, I'm just confused as to how I should feel about my mom now. She's been texting me every day ever since I left, begging for me to come back and that she'll speak to my stepdad and make things better for me now. The thing is, I hate to be the one to say this about my own mother, but I have a nagging suspicion that she's saying this just because my grandpa told her that he's going to stop sending her money now. I don't know what's real anymore, and I'm freaking out because I love my mother. But it's just hard to see her in the same way now that I know what I know. Honestly, I just want to be sure I'm not crazy for taking this to my heart. So AITA for not wanting to go back to living with my mother after she let my stepdad mistreat me and lied to me about having no financial help. Update 1. I posted the last update 3 days ago, and it's been almost a week since I moved to my grandparents' house. I didn't respond to my mother's texts or calls after I learned that my grandparents had been helping her out all along, as I was majorly confused regarding my feelings about this new piece of information. But she didn't stop texting me and kept trying to convince me to come back. And when I still didn't respond, she decided to come visit me instead. Yesterday, she came over in the evening, and it was really awkward for us to meet each other after almost a week of no contact from my end. And moreover, both of us now knew the truth about all the money and stuff, so it was just plain weird. My grandparents seemed very uneasy and stiff as well. After asking me how I'd been and how was school, my mother asked my grandparents if she could speak to me alone. They weren't that happy about it, but they agreed, and my mother and I headed up to my room. Once she was sure that we were out of earshot, she became all panicked and jittery and told me that I needed to move back in with her right now. She seemed like a different person after she dropped the pretense of looking calm and composed, and I could sense that something was wrong. I explained to her that I absolutely detested my stepdad and couldn't possibly live under the same roof as him anymore, and she needed to respect that. I also told her that I was hurt and disappointed by the fact that she'd been lying to me all my life about how she'd never had anyone to support her when it came to money, and that I wouldn't have thought any less of her had she been truthful about all the help that she'd received from my grandparents. She apologized to me and told me that she'd always wanted me to see her as a hardworking and independent woman, and she was afraid that admitting to the fact that she used to take money from her in laws would make me think of her as weak. Then she told me that while she'd married my stepdad, believing him to be a good man, he'd proven that he wasn't. But she'd already quit her job now and was completely relying on him for money. Her own savings were almost down to zero after she'd bought the house and furniture, and she desperately needed the money, which is why she was putting up with her husband's behavior. And after that, she told me something that explained her submissive behavior in these past few weeks, and also why she seemed so panicked and anxious. She'd found out that she was pregnant again, and while she wanted to leave my stepdad, she couldn't because she had no money. And on top of that, she was also pregnant. By the time she was done telling me everything, she was in tears, and so was I. She told me that the morning after I'd run away, she'd suspected that I'd gone to my grandparents' place, and one call confirmed it. She told her husband that she needed to go and apologize to me so that I'd come back, but he refused to let her go, saying that they were better off without me. Even yesterday, she told me that she'd lied to her husband, saying that she needed to go shopping for some groceries, that she needed to make dinner, and even that led him to scream at her for being careless before he finally let her go. She begged me to come back with her so that she would at least have someone she trusted in the house with her. Plus, yes, the money that my grandparents sent her would help too. Her plan made no sense. But I could tell she just wanted a way out of this mess, which is why she was so nervous. I somehow managed to calm her down and get her to relax a bit before I told her that she could live here with my grandparents as well. Initially, she was extremely opposed to the idea of it and said that she couldn't possibly do that since she didn't want to be a burden. But after almost 15 minutes of trying to convince her that this was the best way forward, she agreed. I went downstairs and explained the whole situation to my grandparents, and to my amazement, it didn't take them even half a second to agree to the arrangement that I'd suggested. They didn't even need to think before they said yes. And that was that. It's been almost a day, and my mother is still in a daze and has said nothing except for a very nervous and teary thank you to my grandparents. We're trying to find a good family lawyer who can file for divorce, and I'm hoping that this all turns out well. I feel terrible that my mother had to go through all of this by herself for the past few days, but now, hopefully, things will change for the better. Update 2. 2 weeks have passed since the last update. My stepdad never bothered to find out where my grandparents lived. So while he's been harassing my mother and demanding that she come back nonstop by text and trying to call her every day, he wasn't able to find us. A few days ago, my grandparents finally found a reputable lawyer and my mother filed for divorce. She almost didn't go through with it because she was afraid of the consequences, but after a lot of reassurance, it was finally done. And then something really terrifying happened. I'm just glad that none of my loved ones were hurt. A day after my stepdad was served, he was somehow able to find where my grandparents lived and decided to pay us a visit. It was really late at night, and he rang the doorbell 4 to 5 times before I got up to open it. As soon as I opened the door, my stepdad grabbed me by the throat and pushed me back while cursing and yelling at me. He called me every derogatory word he knew and asked me where my mother was hiding and how dare she serve him with divorce papers when she'd been living on his money for the past few months. I was struggling to breathe and almost thought I was done for, but thankfully, my grandpa came to the rescue in the nick of time and managed to knock him out with a vase. I let go, and as soon as my grandparents were sure that I was all right, they called the police. What happened next was all a blur, but he was arrested, and he went with them quite willingly, but promised to make our lives hell for as long as he was around. My mother, thankfully, had fallen asleep by then and didn't witness any of this. She only learned about it the next day, and that led to another crying fit. My grandparents and I reassured her that everything was going to be fine, but she was still terrified. I'm guessing the pregnancy hormones combined with the emotional distress of the divorce is stressing her out. We're looking into therapists as well to help her out so that her mental state doesn't affect the baby. At least after what happened, my stepdad isn't going to be coming around for a while for sure. Update 3. Months have passed since the last update, and it's finally all good news. My mother is a divorced woman now, and we're all thrilled for her. Her divorce was finalized a couple of days ago, and we also managed to get a restraining order against my ex stepdad. Not just that, my mother has single custody of her future child since her ex husband has proved himself to be violent and incapable of being trusted with a child. He managed to avoid major prison time, but what he did still earned him almost a month, which really wasn't enough, if you ask me. Anyway, my mother got almost everything in the divorce, including the house, the furniture, their car, and yes, she's going to get child support from my stepdad as well. So it all worked out in our favor. My mother and I have decided to sell the house and furniture and continue living with our grandparents, though. She's trying to make up for everything that has happened in the past and build a better relationship with all of us now, so I'm happy about that. And she's also started helping out in running the bakery by putting her marketing major to use. I'm doing better than ever at school again, and things are finally looking up. My mother's almost 9 months pregnant now, and we're all extremely excited to meet the new baby. I'm finally okay. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.